Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that your country no longer exists. Not metaphorically, not politically, literally. The government is gone, the army has surrendered, the cities are burning, the money in your pocket is becoming worthless by the hour, and the only thing separating your family from starvation is whatever you can trade before nightfall. Most Americans have never experienced anything remotely like this, but in the spring of 1945, millions of Germans did. What you're watching right now is not just an old military film. It was shown to American soldiers before they entered occupied Germany. Its purpose was simple: prepare them for what they were about to see. But hidden beneath these images is a much larger story. A story of collapse, of propaganda, of survival, of ordinary people trapped inside events so enormous that they could barely understand them while they were happening. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a story that contains warnings many people believe are becoming relevant once again. Because history rarely repeats itself exactly, but human behavior often does. And when societies become desperate, frightened, and uncertain about the future, the same patterns tend to emerge, the same promises, the same fears, the same mistakes. To understand why this film was made, we have to travel back to a Germany that looked very different from the one we know today. A Germany where millions of people genuinely believed they were witnessing the rebirth of their nation. A Germany still haunted by the scars of the First World War. A Germany where inflation had become so extreme that workers rushed to spend their wages before prices doubled again. Children played with stacks of banknotes that had become less valuable than the paper they were printed on. Families watched their life savings disappear. Veterans returned from war to a country that felt broken, humiliated, directionless. And when people become desperate enough, they often begin searching for someone who promises certainty. Someone who claims to have simple answers. Someone who says they alone can restore greatness. History shows us that such moments can be dangerous. Because people rarely embrace extreme ideas when life is comfortable. They do so when they feel they have nothing left to lose. And that is where our story truly begins.
You'll see flowers. You'll see some mighty pretty scenery. Don't let it fool you. You are in enemy country. Be alert. Suspicious of everyone. Take no chances. You are up against something more than tourist scenery. You are up against German
What you're seeing here is just the surface. Because once American troops crossed into Germany, everything they believed they knew about the war started to change. Part 2 reveals what they were never prepared for. If you want to see the full film, make sure to subscribe. And let me know in the comments, do you see patterns like this repeating today?
Blood and iron. The armies, German. Under the Prussian Bismarck, the German Empire was built. The German states combined, serving notice to all that their religion was iron.
And that is where our story truly begins. Because by the time American soldiers were preparing to enter Germany in 1945, they weren't walking into a mystery. At least, that's what they believed. For years, newspapers, radio broadcasts, government reports, and military briefings had painted a picture of Germany that seemed easy to understand. A nation consumed by fanaticism. A population united behind a regime that had plunged the world into war. But history is rarely that simple. What many soldiers would soon discover was a country filled with contradictions. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, they encountered something unexpected. Not cheering crowds, not organized resistance around every corner. In many places, they found exhaustion. Entire cities had become landscapes of rubble. Streets that once carried thousands of people each day now looked like scenes from another planet. Buildings stood hollowed out like skeletons. Churches had lost their roofs. Factories had been reduced to twisted steel and broken brick. And among those ruins were millions of civilians trying to survive one more day. For years, German propaganda had promised victory. It had promised secret weapons. It had promised that sacrifice would be rewarded. Even as the situation deteriorated, many citizens continued hearing optimistic reports on the radio while Allied bombers filled the skies overhead. The gap between what people were told and what they could see with their own eyes became impossible to ignore. Some families still believed the war could somehow be turned around. Others knew it was over long before the official surrender. But speaking openly carried risks. In a society where neighbors reported neighbors and criticism could bring severe consequences, silence often felt safer than honesty. Then came the bombing campaigns. Night after night, air raid sirens echoed through cities across Germany. Families rushed into basements and shelters. Children learn to distinguish sounds most people pray they never hear: the distant hum of engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the violent impact that could erase an entire street in seconds. For those who survived, sleep became a luxury. Many children grew up believing that waking up alive each morning was never guaranteed. And yet, even in those conditions, ordinary life continued in strange ways. Schools remained open when possible. Shops sold what little they could. Weddings still took place. Birthdays were celebrated. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to create normality in the middle of chaos. That may be one of the most remarkable lessons of history. People rarely realize they are living through historic events. Most are simply trying to make it through the week. As the war entered its final months, another reality emerged. Germany was running out of almost everything. Fuel was scarce. Food was becoming harder to find. Transportation networks were collapsing. Entire communities depended on rumors because reliable information had become nearly impossible to obtain. And then came the moment many had feared for years. The front lines arrived. The war was no longer something happening somewhere else. It was outside their front door. For American soldiers crossing into Germany, this created a strange and often uncomfortable situation. They had spent years fighting an enemy, yet now they found themselves face to face with civilians who looked less like conquerors and more like survivors of a disaster. Women carrying buckets through ruined streets, old men searching for firewood, children wandering among mountains of rubble where neighborhoods once stood. The reality they encountered was far more complicated than the briefings had suggested. And the deeper they moved into Germany, the more questions began to emerge. Questions about responsibility, questions about guilt, questions about what ordinary people knew, and questions that historians continue debating to this very day.
It cost hours, days, and years that will never return.
And yet, even as the ruins stretched farther than anyone had expected, something else began to surface beneath the smoke and dust. Information, not the kind found in official reports or battlefield maps, but fragments of truth carried in whispered conversations, broken sentences, and hesitant confessions. American units moving through occupied towns began to notice a pattern. When they asked civilians what they had known about the war, the answers rarely came in certainty. They came in layers. Some people insisted they had known nothing at all, that they had simply worked, raised children, and tried to survive while politics unfolded somewhere above their reach. Others spoke in fragments: rumors heard at the bakery, comments from a soldier on leave, a newspaper headline quickly forgotten. And then there were those who knew more than they first admitted. Not necessarily because they had supported what was happening, but because silence had become a form of protection. In a system where questioning could be dangerous, not asking questions often felt like the only safe option left. But safety and truth rarely coexist for long. In several towns, Allied troops discovered offices where documents had been hastily destroyed. Burned files still smoldered in courtyards. Paper fragments clung to wet ash like pieces of a shattered memory. Whatever had been stored there was never meant to be seen again. Yet not everything could be erased. In cellars beneath administrative buildings, in abandoned schoolrooms, and behind sealed storage doors, remnants remained. Lists, correspondence, records that pointed toward a machinery far more organized than the chaos outside suggested. At first, many soldiers assumed they were looking at isolated evidence. Individual cases of wrongdoing, exceptions in an otherwise collapsing system. But as more territory was secured, a different picture began to form. A network of administration that had extended into nearly every part of daily life. And with it, a realization that grew heavier with each passing day. The war had not only been fought on battlefields. It had also been managed through paperwork, bureaucracy, and ordinary participation. Meanwhile, the civilians themselves were undergoing a quiet transformation of their own. Liberation did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. For many, it came as confusion, fear, relief, shame, sometimes all at once. Some welcomed the arriving soldiers with exhaustion rather than celebration. Others avoided them entirely, watching from behind broken windows, uncertain what the next chapter would bring. And some simply continued doing what they had always done, searching for food, caring for family, trying to rebuild routines from the fragments left behind. In the midst of this, a recurring question began to surface among the occupying forces. If an entire nation had been exposed to years of messaging, fear, and controlled information, where exactly did responsibility begin? With those who gave the orders? With those who enforced them? Or with those who, in one way or another, lived within the system without ever openly resisting it? There were no simple answers in the rubble of 1945. Only encounters, only testimonies, only the slow and often uncomfortable process of trying to understand how something so large could have been carried out by so many ordinary hands. And as the war in Europe officially ended, another struggle quietly began. Not for territory, not for victory, but for interpretation, because what had just happened would not remain locked in the past. It would be questioned, reconstructed, and argued over for generations to come. And somewhere within those unanswered questions, the hidden archive was already beginning to take shape. At first, no one called it an archive. There was no official name for what was being collected, no clear structure, no directive signed at the top of a military report. It began more like a habit among intelligence officers and translators attached to advancing Allied units. A letter here, a diary there, a photograph pulled from a collapsed desk drawer, a school notebook with names and dates carefully written in childish handwriting, sitting beside administrative records stamped with cold precision. Individually, none of it seemed extraordinary. Together, it began to feel like something else entirely. By the summer of 1945, as the fighting in Europe had ended and occupation zones were being established, teams were moving not just through cities but through layers of information. Every town seemed to contain its own version of what had happened. Every building that still stood offered another fragment of a larger picture no one had fully assembled yet. In some cases, civilians willingly handed over documents. In others, materials were discovered by accident during rebuilding efforts. A hidden compartment behind a false wall, a sealed box buried under floorboards, a bundle of papers wrapped in cloth and forgotten in a basement that had survived when everything above it had not. And slowly, a pattern emerged, not of single events, but of structure, orders that repeated across regions, forms that looked identical despite being issued in different cities, lists that followed the same logic, the same categories, the same language. It was the repetition that unsettled those who studied it most. Because repetition suggested coordination, and coordination suggested intent. Among the Allied personnel, a quiet effort began to preserve these materials. At first, it was practical, evidence for investigations, material for tribunals, documentation for historical record. But over time, something less official took shape. A separate collection, not fully catalogued, not fully accessible, a shadow archive built from fragments that did not always fit neatly into the official narrative that would later be presented to the world. They began referring to it in informal conversations with a name that stuck. The hidden archive. No single person claimed to have created it. No single office took ownership. It existed instead as a growing accumulation of what the war had left behind once the headlines moved on. But the most difficult material was not always the written record. It was the testimonies, interviews with civilians who struggled to describe what they had lived through without contradicting themselves. Statements from former officials who spoke in careful, defensive language, measuring every word as if it might later be used against them. And accounts from soldiers on all sides who described moments that did not align with the simplified versions of victory and defeat. One intelligence officer assigned to document these interviews noted something in his personal report that would later be quoted again and again in internal discussions. The facts are not missing. They are scattered, and the meaning depends on how you assemble them. As autumn approached, occupation authorities began to realize that winning the war had been the easier part. The harder task was now unfolding in offices, interrogation rooms, and temporary administrative buildings across Germany. Because every answer seemed to lead to another question, and every document raised the possibility that there were more documents still undiscovered. In this atmosphere, the hidden archive grew, not officially sanctioned, not openly discussed in public reports, but steadily expanding in private files and restricted cabinets. And with each new piece added, the same unsettling realization returned. The story of what had happened was far from complete. It had only just begun to reveal its missing parts.